Hydrosphere Rising, Chapter 3. Late that night, Owens Boat was on its way up the coast. When he had said goodbye to his parents at their jetty, he had been excited about starting a new adventure. But now, the enormity of his task had dawned on him again. He felt very alone and vulnerable in his small, 8-metre-long boat. Looking out at the black, unimaginable vastness of the ocean, he thought of the first line from the poem. A huge octopus spreads its tentacles over the ocean. He shivered and didn't want to imagine what that meant. Who really knew what was out there in all that water? The surface of Mars was still much better known than the deep waters of the Earth. He looked to the other side and saw what was once called Bondi Beach. It was now Bondi Bay, as the beach had long been underwater. In fact, nearly all the beaches in Australia were now gone due to rising waters. He could also just make out the giant boulders that had been thrown onto the foreshore by the great superstorm of 2109. The poem had been right about waves slicing open the earth. The superstorm's waves had cut through the sea barrier walls as if they were paper and destroyed half of the buildings in Bondi. 10 years later, reconstruction was still going on. It was past midnight when Owen reached the middle of Sydney Harbour. The only sound was the constant lapping of water as the boat's silent electric motor pushed it over the sandstone ruins of Fort Denison, which was now completely submerged. Owen looked out towards the Botanic Gardens. In front he could see the broken dyke wall, and beyond it the water that now flooded a quarter of the gardens. The light from buildings that remained standing reflected on its surface. The pond where he had fed eels as a child was now underwater, and the eels swimming free in the ocean and rivers. The dyke wall had been built and continually extended over the last 70 years to protect the city from rising sea level. But the 2109 superstorm had destroyed much of it, and some of the city too. The Circular Quay ferry wharves had been totally obliterated, and the water now flooded the buildings behind them, and also a lot of the historic buildings in the Rocks area. Many that hadn't fallen had been demolished, and a new waterfront had been built about 100 metres behind where the old one had been. Some people had called for the dyke to be restored, but it was deemed too expensive when so much of the city needed repairs, and others argued that the next superstorm would just destroy it again. Owen looked across to Sydney Harbour Bridge, which by a miracle had survived the superstorm. It had stood for nearly 200 years and would probably stand for another 200. Of course, it was continually maintained and upgraded, the steel structure reinforced with carbon fibre, but it still had its iconic shape. The amusement park under its northern end had not fared so well. After the storm, the large clown's mouth that had always been its entrance was found on top of a hill 5 kilometres away. Now the whole site was flooded, its own dyke wall having been destroyed. The building called Coney Island that housed historic funhouse attractions was now really an island, and the Hall of Mirrors only amused swarms of jellyfish. The object of Owen's journey now came into view. It had also been hit hard when the 30-metre-high superstorm wave had come rolling across the harbour. It was true investigators had discovered afterwards that years of sea level rise had flooded and slowly eroded its foundations, but nobody could have predicted the result. The wave had hit the concrete sails above the opera theatre first, reducing them to rubble. Then the incredible weight of water had actually pushed the 4 huge concrete sails above the concert hall over at 45 degrees. The sails now lay half in the water on the bridge side. The concert hall itself had also tilted and was now partially flooded. It certainly fit the description from the poem. A giant sea snail, as big as a cruise ship, lies dead on its side, shell cracked into 4 pieces. Owen could see the red blinking lights of a security drone as it circled the ruins of the Sydney Opera House. Drones had patrolled the city for many years, and the most efficient way to control them was with the Australian AI. It could monitor the infrared cameras of hundreds of thousands of drones simultaneously without raising an electronic sweat. Owen had to get inside the Opera House, and he didn't want one of those drones to spot him. He watched the red blinking lights until they headed off to Circular Quay, and then he made his move. He brought the boat up quickly and silently to where the wire fence that now surrounded the ruins came out of the water. He stepped out onto the deck with his wire cutters in hand, but then he noticed something curious. The wire next to one of the metal poles had already been cut, but had been hooked back into place so it looked untouched at first glance. All he had to do was unhook the fence and pull it back to the other side of the boat, then nudge the boat forward using the remote control on his mini-screen and rehook the fence afterwards. He was congratulating himself on this job when he saw, from the corner of his eye, a blinking red light coming fast from the Botanic Gardens. Owen swore under his breath and then frantically looked for a way to hide. It was too late to go back through the fence. The red light was almost upon him. Then he saw it, a darker patch in the tangle of wreckage under the broken concrete sail, wide enough for a small boat to get through. This must have been where his parents brought the salvaged organ pipes out from the concert hall all those years ago. He quickly piloted the boat towards the opening and just made it inside as the blinking red light came over. Owen held his breath as he watched the drone hover for a moment. Maybe it had seen the wake of his boat on the water. After what seemed like ages, the drone continued on its way towards Circular Quay, and he let out a sigh of relief. That was drenching close. In the commotion he had not looked about him, but now he shone the light from his torch around and came face to face with a strange jellyfish creature. It looked like something from another planet, but luckily it was just part of a large mural of stylized sea creatures that was now half underwater. He remembered the words from Evelyn's poem, "Creatures are sprouting in the deep." The dim light showed him the shapes of real jellyfish now swimming alongside their painted cousins. Owen sat on the front of the boat and shone the light down into the water as he carefully steered it remotely. He could dimly see submerged stairways and railings below and was careful to avoid any obstacles. To ensure he didn't miss any clues, he ran through the final 2 stanzas of the poem in his head. There is a cave inside where an old pipe organ starts to play like a waking demon. At the centre is a tower of lights. I am tumbling in the air, and my face is shining. Eventually, he went through a large opening where a wall had collapsed, and beyond was only darkness as far as his torch could reach. By the sound of the echoes and the feel of the air, he could tell he was in a large space. When he turned on the boat's floodlights, he caught his breath. It was an amazing sight. A huge white cave with hundreds of seats rising out of the water on all sides. The vast white ceiling covered by strange blocky stalactites and shaped in terraces, getting smaller until they joined together over what must have once been the stage. Everything was slanting to the right. He nudged the boat forward, and as its lights illuminated the stage, he saw what was left of the pipe organ. There were only a few pipes left, but the organ keyboard was now submerged, and when he shone his torch down on it, he could see the keys and stop valves covered in barnacles. He could imagine King Neptune sitting down to play on it, music that would make the ocean tremble. Just then he heard the strangest, most beautiful, and at the same time most disturbing sound. It was like whale song, but there was something discordant about it and haunting, like a cry for help from the very ocean itself. The jellyfish swimming over and around the organ keyboard seemed to pause, like dancers waiting for their cue. It must have been the wind blowing over some of the old organ pipes. Now he fully understood the lines from the poem. An old pipe organ starts to play like a waking demon. She must have been here. It was the only explanation. Then he looked up and he understood the rest of the poem. At the centre is a tower of lights. There was a metal frame covered with rusting stage lights that once must have stretched right across the ceiling. The chain on the left side had broken, and that end now lay in the water, forming a tower that reached from the water to high up on the opposite wall. If he climbed the tower, he might find some clue from Evelyn. He brought the boat around under the frame and pulled hard on it to make sure it could take his weight. Then he began to climb. It was tricky finding his footing on the rusted metal, and at the same time looking for some sign that Evelyn had been there. A few times the entire structure swayed dangerously, and he had to fumble for a handhold. When he reached the top, he felt like an idiot. There was nothing there, only the wall of the concert hall. Owen said the last lines of the poem over and over to himself. I am tumbling in the air and my face is shining. But it didn't make any sense. How could she be tumbling? There was only one thing he could think of, and lucky he was not scared of heights. Feeling even more stupid than before, he hooked his feet under the metal of the frame and hung upside down, facing the wall. Now he was tumbling, but how on earth could his face be shining? He hung there for a minute, thinking this was the craziest thing he had ever done. He was about to pull himself up, when on an impulse, he put the torch in his mouth. His face was shining now. And then he saw it. Scratched into the wall was a letter E, with a circle around it. Immediately he thought, E for Evelyn. It was a sign from her. Then he noticed a crack running around the wall panel. He pressed on the panel, and it swung inwards. This must have been a hatch for the backstage technicians to access the lighting frame. He grabbed the top edge of the hatch and slowly pulled himself inside. That's the end of chapter 3. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. And also remember to subscribe so you don't miss chapter 4. Otherwise, the ebook is available from Amazon, either for free or just 99 cents. See the links in the comments. Thanks for listening, and look forward to seeing you next time.